Hey, welcome to night 2 of life. I think you all know who I am, but I'm John. I'm going to be delivering our talk tonight, if I get my words out properly. And let me just get us to our first slide. So, as Eric indicated tonight, we're talking about, we're continuing really from the subject we talked about last week of truth. And we're talking about how do we know whether it's true? What we're talking about when we talk about Jesus, when we talk about the Bible. And one observation we can start with is that there are things in life that are useful, or can be useful, without being true. The example we've used every year in this is Band-Aids. It's an easy one. Now, of course, in the right context, like I'm a nurse, and I use Band-Aids a little bit. We usually use something a little bit more sophisticated. It's a big Band-Aid. But honestly, that's exactly what it is. But like medically, Band-Aids can be really useful in the right context. But if you're a parent, you're probably aware that there are other ways to use them as well. If your kids fall over and they're upset and they go, it's ouchy, it hurts. In fact, like parents have a choice in that moment, the first time that happens, of what sort of parent they're going to be. Are you going to be a parent who gives them a Band-Aid when they ask for a Band-Aid, or are you going to say, that doesn't need a Band-Aid, and have to argue that out with a 3-year-old who's just rock solid, certain they need a Band-Aid? But if you give them one, it's useful, because it helps them feel better, and they go away happy. A kiss on it is the budget version of it. Now, the Band-Aid hasn't done anything objective there. There wasn't a wound that required dressing. It hasn't recovered them physically, but the kid feels better, right? Adults do the same thing. In fact, people do it all through life. We can turn to things that are useful in a sense, but that actually keep us from the truth. So, for instance, we're feeling overwhelmed, or we're feeling really flat. I don't know if you relate to that happening in your life. And rather than deal with the things causing it, we might eat a bunch of chocolate. It's a popular one. Or we might watch a bunch of telly. Or we might go shopping. Or we might, for some people, get high, drink a bunch of alcohol, or whatever. Some things that we use them to numb us to the rough edges of life. Meaning we don't have to face the hard truths. And so, what about Christianity? Is Christianity...
Didn't work, John.
Didn't work. Oh, man. Is Christianity just religious therapy? This is a thing that comes up a bit, right? A thing that makes people feel better about themselves, but there's no truth for it, no proof that it actually solves the problems. Is Christianity just a bunch of superstitious stories that make people feel better? If you know Ricky Gervais, he's an actor. He made things like the original UK version of The Office, which was the boring version of the US version of The Office, famous. He's a keen atheist. He makes no secret of the fact. And on a talk show where the host, Stephen Colbert, who I believe is a Christian, asked him why he was an atheist, Ricky responded, well, you know what, there are at least 3,000 gods that people have believed in, so I only believe in one less than you. What makes us think that Christianity is real? What gives us the right to claim that this God is any more real than the others? Put it negatively, is Christianity just a hoax? There's a lot of people who have claimed that over the years. Did it work?
Yep.
Cool. Last week, we looked at the claims of Jesus. If you missed it, he made some big claims. We covered only a few of them, but Jesus came into the world with some amazing statements about himself. That he is God in the flesh and has come to give us the life that we are all chasing. He goes further in saying that without him, we're like flowers in a vase that wither and die because we're cut off from the source of life that we were created to have. And yet Jesus says that he gives life freely. He says, I have come that they might have life and have it to the full. A life of purpose and meaning that goes on forever. That is a massive claim, isn't it? And if the Bible's account of things is true, it's unbelievably good news. Which kind of circles us back around again to that question, is Christianity just a hoax? Because if it is, it can sound as good as it wants, but, it's just a band-aid. Perhaps the critical question to get at in order to answer that big question is this. Is the Bible from which we get all the claims of Jesus, is the Bible telling the truth? Because if it is, then Christianity is real. Because Christianity just goes, hey, look at the Bible. That's what Christianity is. And there's two important sub-questions to that one. Has the Bible been changed over time? Are the witnesses who wrote the Bible trustworthy? We're going to consider those in a moment, but first, a bit of Bible background for you. The Bible has, this will be obvious reading for some of you, it'll be new for some. The Bible has 66 books. It's not just one book, it's 66 books within one book. 40 authors. It was written over a period of roughly 1,500 years. That's a long time. That's kind of, I don't know what was happening 1,500 years ago. Anyone good at history?
The Roman Empire was crumbling?
Yeah. That's about, well, it would have crumbled about 150 years ago. Something like that. So we'd be as close to the Roman Empire right now as we are to Victoria in this moment. Queen Victoria, not the state. It's written in 3 languages. It's written on 3 different continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And yet it provides one remarkably unified story. It's made up of 2 parts. You have an Old Testament and a New Testament on the table in front of you there. You've got a few copies of the New Testament. That's why it looks narrower than other Bibles that you've seen. And the Old Testament concerns the ancient people of Israel, God's chosen people in the Old Testament, the promises that God made to them, and some of the ways that those promises worked out in history. And then there's the New Testament, which is much shorter, written between 50 and 90 AD. And the New Testament focuses in on Jesus, on who he is and how he is the fulfillment of the promises that are made in the Old Testament. Finally, the Bible makes an extraordinary claim about itself, that behind all human authors, this comes into the conversation we're having over here, behind all the human authors stands one divine author, stands God, overseeing and preserving what they wrote, so that we can know the truth about him, about ourselves, and about the world that we live in. So the Bible isn't claiming to be one of many options in life, understand, but the absolute authority over everybody's life. It's a pretty audacious claim, worth looking into. Last week we ended with the challenge that we have to do something with Jesus. Because of the claims that he made, he's either a lunatic, or he's a liar, or he's the Lord. But it's possible that there's a fourth option there that we didn't really look at last week, which is he could be a legend. Like King Arthur. Everyone's heard of King Arthur, correct?
Who?
Thanks, Eric. That's why you're the MC. King Arthur, maybe he's a person who started out as a historical figure, had some fantastic stories told about them, and over time the stories get bigger. The table goes from a small rectangular kid's table to a round table, and the king becomes mythically large, and the fork in the pudding eventually becomes a sword in a stone, and over time this legend forms. It's an exaggerated form of what originally happened. Maybe it's the same with Jesus. He was real, he was an alright guy, he taught some lovely stuff, but the stories about him just kind of blew out of proportion over time. So here's our first question to get at that. Did that work? Here's our first question to get at that. Is this book reliable, or has it been changed? And we're going to get some help with this one from a video. And so I'm going to get out of the way and let that happen, if it works. After Eric goes and turns up the volume.
Oh! Go on, Eric. Thank you.
Nice one, Eric. Did you do something else?
I just touched the desk.
Okay. Go with that.
Like me, it's hard to remember what happened last week, let alone last year or even 10 years ago. That's why so many people struggle to treat the Bible as an historical book. Parts of it were written more than 3,500 years ago. How likely is it that it's made its way into the 21st century without being misremembered, muddled or changed along the way?
We're here to get to the bottom of that question. How close is the book that you find in any hotel room to the original manuscripts?
In short, how reliable is the Bible?
I'll be asking internationally recognised historians to tell us what they think of the Bible as an historical source.
And I'll be helping us look at the big picture. How has the Bible lasted in comparison to other historical documents? And how do experts work out if they can trust anything history shows us?
Dr. Chris Forbes is the Senior Lecturer in Ancient History at Macquarie University and the Deputy Chairman of the Society for the Study of Early Christianity. He's an expert at coming to grips with ancient manuscripts, especially those where the original copies are no longer available. How do historians go about judging the accuracies of manuscripts if the original isn't available?
It depends how many copies you've got. Usually you'll have lots of copies written at different times in different places. And what you do is you compare them and cross-check them and try and work out how the copies have been made over time and where the errors have crept in. Because if you can do that, you can kind of back-project to what the original would have been by looking at the way the errors have crept into the copying process.
Experts can test the level of care scribes took by studying the hundreds of copies of the manuscripts available today. When they examine two copies that are to all intents and purposes identical, they know the copies share a common source. When they discover identical copies that are separated by time and space, they can infer their common source is much older, and the accuracy has been maintained over a lot of copies in between. So we're looking at two things, the number of good copies and the time gap between them and the originals. It's also worth comparing how the New Testament documents stand up compared to other ancient writings. For example, Plato wrote his dialogues around 400 BC. The earliest manuscript copy we have is dated around 900 AD. That's a time gap of 1,300 years. We have 7 copies. Julius Caesar wrote a record of his Gallic Wars around 50 BC. We have 10 copies. The earliest is again dated around 900 AD. That's a time gap of about 1,000 years. Cornelius Tacitus was one of the greatest of the Roman historians. He wrote in about 100 AD. The earliest manuscript is thought to be about 1,100 years after the original. We have 20 copies, but in each case, historians think that's solid evidence.
How many copies of New Testament manuscripts do we have in comparison to other ancient texts?
Well, the short answer is we are better off for the New Testament than we are for any other ancient author. The early Christians made lots and lots of copies. If you're talking about manuscripts written in the original ancient Greek language, then the answer is about 5,500 copies. And if you're talking about copies made within 300 years of the originals, that is to say, before 400 AD, then the answer is about 120. If you're talking about copies in the original language, which was Greek, and in other languages that it was translated into in the ancient world, then the answer is about 20,000 different copies, either complete or in fragments.
What is the gap between the original writings and the events that they describe?
Well, that depends which part of the New Testament you're talking about. If you're talking about some of the earliest documents in the New Testament, the letters of St. Paul, for example, then sometimes they're describing events that are absolutely contemporary. He's writing to the church in Corinth about what's going on in Corinth. But he also refers back to events like, for example, the resurrection of Jesus. And when he does that, he's talking about events less than 25 years earlier. When you come to the Gospels, on the other hand, there's a gap of between 30, 35, 40, maybe as many as 50 years between the lifetime of Jesus and the writing down of the Gospels. The earliest of them is probably Mark's Gospel, and that's probably written within 40 years of the events it's describing.
So compared to other ancient historical sources, the New Testament has many, many more manuscripts, and the time gap is very, very small. It's also worth considering the care taken by the Bible scribes, those responsible for copying and recopying the biblical records. The Jewish culture that produced the books of the Bible believed they were working with words inspired by God. Originally, each book was written on a scroll. A mistake in an Old Testament scroll required an entire section to be discarded and begun again. A mistake involving the name of God required the whole scroll to be rewritten. Scribes often counted the number of words in each book, sometimes even the letters, to ensure nothing was missed out.
How significant are the inaccuracies?
Most of them are completely insignificant. Most of them are just the ancient equivalent of typos, or punctuation changes, or a word with a misspelling into another word, something like that. The bigger the changes are, the easier it is to track them in the manuscript tradition, and the great majority really don't matter at all.
But what about the gaps in time between the events and the writing of the original Bible manuscripts? How do we know that errors didn't creep in as the information travelled by word of mouth before it was finally written down? Could it run the risk of becoming a case of Chinese whispers?
Dr. John Dixon is a media commentator and author. I've come to ask him about the practice of passing on information by word of mouth and whether it's reliable. Why did ancient cultures use, even prefer, oral history?
Mainly because so few people could read. So out of necessity, people had to rely on other methods of preserving their most important stories. We can estimate that about 10 to 15% of people could read in Palestine in the period of Jesus, and this was slightly up on other cultures like Greece and Rome. But because only a small percentage of the population could read and write, they had to preserve their most important stories by telling them and retelling them, telling them and retelling them. And we know from plenty of references to oral tradition that it was very deeply trusted.
What evidence is there for accurate oral history in the New Testament manuscripts?
Well, we know generally that oral tradition was accurate and trusted because of references to it across, not just the New Testament, but across ancient literature generally, that they testify to the fact that oral tradition preserved things well. But most importantly in the New Testament, as you asked, we can actually look at a couple of references of oral tradition that have been preserved by different authors. Best example is an account of the Last Supper of Jesus, where he breaks some bread and says, "This is my body." He passes a cup of wine around and says, "This is my blood." And we know that the Apostle Paul records this tradition in his letter to the Corinthians. But the great thing is, we have another example of the same story being written down from 20 years later in the Gospel of Luke. And Luke didn't have a copy of 1 Corinthians, so he's not copying what Paul said. He's just preserving the oral tradition. And when you line those two things up, it's very clear they're the same.
Both the Apostle Paul's letter to the church at Corinth and the Gospel of Luke contain basically the same passage. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." Paul wrote his letter to the Corinthians in 55 AD. Luke wrote 2 decades later. Historians know that neither had access to the other's material. Together, the manuscripts demonstrate oral history working to a high degree of accuracy to bridge the gap. Historians are satisfied that when they're looking at today's Bible, they're dealing with historically accurate, largely unaltered manuscripts.
And that these manuscripts faithfully record the oral accounts of first century events.
But that isn't the end of our questions about the Bible. We'll see you next time.
I love those videos, partly because they're really helpful and they dig into the truth, and partly because, I don't know if I'm going to table over here, but they give you flashbacks of the acting and production values of Behind the News. Yeah, which is, it's not high cinema. But has the Bible been changed? We can pretty definitively say, and experts say, no. There's really strong documentary evidence that show that these documents, aside from being translated into English, have remained virtually unaltered since they were originally written. We've got really strong evidence for that, overwhelming evidence for that. But then there's the second issue. Maybe this is what was written. Have I got the wrong thing?
There's witnesses.
Did I spell it wrong?
That's right.
Beautiful. Maybe this is what was written, but can you trust the people who were writing it? Were the original authors telling the truth, or were they just making it up? And for that, I'm going to get back out of the way. We've got a second video.
It only takes a single sporting event to understand the concept of bias. Much of what someone will tell you about a game will depend largely on where they've come from and which team they're barracking for.
Many people look at the Bible that way. It may be a reliable historical document, but ultimately it's a biased account written by people who wanted to believe.
How do we know that the Bible writers weren't just fans? Is there any way to tell that their accounts are truthful? That's the question I want answered. Professor Alana Nobbs is the former head of the Department of Ancient History at Macquarie University and the Deputy Director of the Ancient Cultures Research Centre. She's also an internationally respected expert in ancient Greek papyri and the history they contain. Do New Testament documents come with a prejudice?
Well, Lisa, I'm glad you asked that, because it's something we don't often think about, but everything comes in a sense with a bias or prejudice. If you read 2 or more newspaper accounts of the same event, or if you watch 2 or 3 television channels, you'll always find there's a slightly different take on it, and this is what we do find with the New Testament documents.
Does the bias ruin the accounts for historians?
Well, Lisa, no, I don't think it does at all. Let's imagine that you and I are out shopping and a robber comes into the shop. Now, when we tell the police about it, we're not going to say we're biased because we perhaps saw slightly different things or because we've decided that this person is the one who did the robbery. So we think of it like that with the New Testament. People saw Jesus, they experienced his influence and power in their lives, and then they write about it either directly or oral tradition takes over and different people take up the story. But this tells us that Jesus was a real historical person and this was the effect he had on those around him. So I don't think that that is a bias in any sense that's different from any other account that you might find in everyday life or in the newspapers.
Just like a sporting event, bias may affect the tone of the report, but it's unlikely to alter the fundamental facts. Who was playing, which player scores the first points, and the final result. These are the sorts of things that can't be changed. There you go. The witnesses on the sidelines of the events recorded in the New Testament would have been there to challenge accounts if the writers had decided to fabricate them. The Apostle Paul's letter to the church at Corinth actually records one particular event at which 500 people were present. Many witnesses to Jesus' life, both friends and enemies, still would have been alive when the authors wrote their accounts. In fact, their different approaches and backgrounds make the New Testament writers quite valuable to historians.
In the New Testament, several authors cover the same basic material. Can they be treated as separate sources?
The books that we have that constitute our New Testament are, as you say, written by several different authors, and moreover they're written in several different types of literature. We've got lives or sort of biographies in the case of the Gospels, we've got the letters of Paul, We've got history in the case of Acts. We've got different types of writing, and each of those needs to be treated as a genre, as a type of writing in its own way. We wouldn't expect exactly the same from a letter as we would from a life or a history. But given that, they do reinforce each other in a number of very important ways. Let me just give you one example. The Apostle Paul is in fact, in writing, our earliest witness to the life of Jesus, and in the course of his various letters, he mentions Jesus' birth, he mentions his mother Mary, he mentions his crucifixion, he mentions Jesus' brothers, he mentions his death, the fact that he was buried. Now all these things are in fact very early witnesses of the life of Jesus, predating our Gospels. So when you compare that with the various Gospel accounts and the ways in which they agree or give a slightly different perspective, all this reinforces our knowledge of the life and times of Jesus, but in no way does it indicate that any of the individual sources are invalid in themselves.
Evidence that backs up key events from the Old Testament can be found in the British Museum. The prison of the Assyrian king Sennacherib records his army's campaign in Israel and the empire's failure to conquer Jerusalem. The Jerusalem tablet from the reign of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar records the city's eventual destruction and the carrying off of the nation of Israel into slavery. Each confirms events discussed in greater detail by the writers of the Old Testament. But historians look at more than manuscripts and artefacts when trying to judge the accuracy of an account.
Does archaeology shed light on the Bible's reliability?
That depends on which period you're talking about. The Bible is a book written over a long period, roughly 1,000 years, and there are some parts of that history for which there simply is no relevant archaeological evidence. And there are some parts where there are really striking points of connection. When you come down to the period of the New Testament, there's an enormous amount of archaeological and inscriptional evidence on monuments that really makes an enormous backdrop against which you can read the New Testament documents.
Do non-Christian writers comment on the spread of the Christian message?
Yes, a number of them do mention it. Josephus, the Jewish historian, writing in the 80s or 90s AD, mentions just in passing that disciples of Jesus still exist in his own time. A couple of Roman biographers or historians, Suetonius and Tacitus, mention the spread of the gospel as far as the city of Rome. And in northwestern Greece, one Greek philosopher, Epictetus, happens to mention in his lectures how courageous the early Christians are and willing even to face death without fear. Of course, there's also the detailed information of Pliny the Younger, who is a Roman governor involved in the persecution of the Christians, and he has a lot to say about them.
Christians couldn't show their support in a way that we might be familiar with today. To begin with, proclaiming there's only one God or refusing to worship the Roman emperor often led to a very ugly end. However, there's plenty of evidence that Christians held to the truth of their beliefs, despite the fact that discovery could result in arrest, torture, and even execution. Some early Christians were first-century graffiti artists, leaving tags in many places that included a combination of the Greek letters chi and rho to represent the word Christ, Jesus' title as God's chosen king. Then there's the famous fish symbol. It didn't start as a car sticker. First-century Christians used it as a secret sign because the Greek word for fish, ichthus, came to represent 5 other words: Jesus, Christos, Theou, Huios, Soter. Jesus Christ, God's Son, the Saviour.
You mentioned persecution of Christians. Is much said of this by ancient non-Christian writers?
Yes, there's a lot of discussion of persecution, and probably the most detailed early account is that by the Roman governor Pliny the Younger, around about 115 AD, who writes to the Emperor Trajan about proper procedure when trying Christians. And he specifically says, if someone claims they used to be a Christian, but have given it up, then he makes them swear by the oath of the emperor and put incense on the emperor's altar, which he says no real Christian can ever be persuaded to do. So for him, that's the test. They won't do it. In later periods, you get a lot of discussion of how courageous the early Christians were in facing persecution, and you get a kind of combination of two factors. One, just bafflement as to why they are so absurdly stubborn, and two, a kind of grudging admiration for their courage in the face of death.
How much of an impact did they have on their society?
Well, over time, a great deal. I think it's probably likely that some of their going to the death for their beliefs spooked some people and they wouldn't want to have anything to do with it, but others were profoundly impressed by their courage at facing death. But the other thing that we know really impressed people was the fact that during outbreaks of epidemics, Christians would sometimes nurse people who were sick when nobody else would for fear of their own health. That made really quite an impact.
So, were the authors of the Bible truthful? What do we find? Sincere accounts that coincide with and verify each other.
Accounts that are backed up by non-Christian historians and supported by archaeological and other kinds of evidence. That's hard to ignore.
But some of the events are so unusual, inquirers today find them hard to believe. Did the witnesses understand what they were seeing? Were they taken in by a grand deception?
Which leads us to another big question for the Bible.
So, it is popular to believe that Jesus was just a legend, and there's only really one issue with believing that, and that's historical facts. It's pretty strong. All evidence points in the opposite direction. Legends take time to develop, but in Jesus' case, from the very beginning, in the very place he did all that he did, thousands were convinced by the facts. And they spread the news everywhere. So we have to contend with the fact that the Bible quite clearly claims that life comes through Jesus, and everything points to the reliability of this book. You know, today and for a long time we've been bombarded with marketing, with scams, and not just with scams, with sales pitches, right? We live in a world made out of sales pitches. So we're used to kind of this idea of being cynical when someone's trying to convince us of something. You know, my favourite example, and this dates me a little bit, guys, sorry about that, but when the Samsung Galaxy S4 phone came out, it came out with, I owned the S3, it was the predecessor, obviously, to that phone, and the new one came out with the catchline, Samsung Galaxy S4, Life Companion. Like this is going to be with you, for your life. And then the next year, the S5 came out. It's awkward, but the Bible is God's message to humanity. That he loves us and wants us to have real life, which is found in relationship with Jesus. That might sound too far-fetched until you check out the evidence. There was no S5 to disprove this. Jesus came into the world offering life to a world that's gone off the rails. And it's not a hoax. It's a good offer. So we need to ask ourselves and consider, have you checked out the evidence for yourself? Is it something you personally have looked into? Let me give you a couple of questions to finish. One of them is just that. As an adult, have you actually read the Bible for yourself? It's very easy just to... we live in an age of just going and looking up the article on the internet that describes it, but going and reading it for yourself is essential, in my mind. Do you struggle to trust the Bible? If you do struggle to trust the Bible, do you struggle because of a lack of evidence? Or do you maybe just not like what it might say to you and mean for you? And finally, here's our discussion question for tonight to kind of get us rolling around our tables. Why might it be easier to believe that the Bible isn't true? And how does it change things if the Bible's claims about Jesus are true?